Hi A&P1 students. In this video we're going to continue talking about muscle tissue, specifically skeletal muscle tissue. Alright, so in the last video we were describing the connective tissues that are associated with skeletal muscle. The next objective, we want to be familiar with the difference between a tendon and an aponeurosis. I know it's kind of a bad name for that, but that's the name they gave it, so we have to use it. So in the last video, I kind of ended talking about how the endomysium that surrounds each skeletal muscle fiber or cell, and the paramysium, which surrounds each fascicle, which is made up of a multitude of little skeletal muscle fibers or cells. And then the epimysium, which surrounds the entire skeletal muscle, how those connective tissues, they don't end when the muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue ends. They continue on and they merge together. And then if they form a cord-like structure, like you see here, then they will become what we call a tendon. And then remember, the function of a tendon is to attach this muscle to an area on a bone. So that's the function of a tendon, is attaching muscles to bones. So that is a tendon if it's cord-like. And again, the tendon's made up of the epimysium, paramysium, and endomysium, as they all kind of merge together when the muscle tissue stops. Okay, and then the aponeurosis, they're not showing it on here, but we're going to go down to our, So tendon is a thick cord-like structure. It's made up of connective tissue. They say dense regular, but as long as you know it's connective tissue. So whereas an aponeurosis, this is the other structure, it is more of a thin, it's still made up of the epimysium, paramysium, and endomysium, like the tendon. So it's made of that dense regular connective tissue. But its shape is more thin and flattened, like a sheet. But it still does the same thing as a tendon, where it's attaching a muscle to a bone. And they're a good example of an aponeurosis. You learned the name of a particular aponeurosis when you were in lab. In lab 6, when we were doing the skeletal muscles, you had to identify the Achilles tendon or calcaneal tendon. So you did identify a tendon, but then you also identified the they either call it the fascia lata or the iliotibial tract. That was that thin, flattened sheet of connective tissue that was on the lateral side of the thigh. And so that's an example of a aponeurosis. So they're made of the same type of tissue, and they are going to connect muscle to bone. But depending on their shape, they'll either be called a tendon if they're cord-like, or aponeurosis if they're kind of a flattened sheet sort of structure. So those are our tendons and aponeuroses that you should be familiar with. So in our next objective, we're going to talk about the function of blood vessels and nerves. So you'll notice that we talk about blood vessels and nerves when we talk about all of our various organs. So we talked about it with the skin, integumentary system, and the skeletal system, as well as the cartilage. So we're going to also be familiar with the blood vessels and nerves that are associated with our skeletal muscle tissue as well. So and kind of why they're there, which pretty much it's usually the same reason no matter what the organ is, or tissue, or a body system. But realize that skeletal muscle is similar to the skeletal system, the bones of the body, because it's very vascular. So it's vascularized. It has an extensive network of blood vessels, and those blood vessels, they will surround the entire muscle cell, but realize they also will branch and divide into smaller and smaller blood vessels that'll eventually end up supplying nutrients and oxygen to the skeletal muscle cells or fibers. And we call those capillaries. That's the very smallest blood vessels that we have in our body. And those are the ones where oxygen can get out of the capillaries and nutrients can get out of them and go to the muscles, in this case skeletal muscle cells or fibers. And then any sort of waste products, carbon dioxide, will leave the skeletal muscle cells or fibers and get back into the capillaries so it can be carried away. So very vascular tissue skeletal muscle is. And again, its role is to bring the needed nutrients and oxygen to the skeletal muscle cells and fibers, as well as the removal of any sort of waste products from that area too. And then innervation, just like with our skeletal muscles, or just like with our skeletal system, it's very innervated. So they use that term, and I'll sometimes use it. It's called innervated. So if a structure, organ, tissue has nerves going to it, we say that it's innervated. And skeletal muscle is very innervated. And we're going to talk in this, for this upcoming exam, we'll talk more about some basics of the nervous system before we actually get into the chapters on the nervous system. But they're the neurons are the cells of the nervous system. They're kind of the nerves that are going to our skeletal muscle. They're made up of a bundle of neurons, and they call them motor neurons because motor indicates movement, and skeletal muscles cause movement of our skeletal system. So they'll call them motor neurons. So the neurons that are taking impulses, we should say, to the skeletal muscle are called motor neurons for that reason. And so we have to have, our skeletal muscles have to have some sort of stimulation from the nervous system, specifically the neurons that are part of the nerve, in order for them to contract. So they generally need that stimulus in order to contract, because that'll set off all the events that have to happen in order for the muscle to contract. So that's what the nerves are doing, is telling the skeletal muscles to contract. And we'll talk more about, again, the basics of the nervous system a little bit later. But that is our blood vessels and nerves and tendons and aponeuroses. So I'm going to stop this video, and then we're going to talk next. We'll get into the microscopic anatomy that we need to know to understand how muscles contract. So we'll get into that in the next video.